Do the wave. Martez, are we ready?
Yeah.
We're good. All right, welcome to our first faculty research lecture of the academic year, and the first one in Berkeley Way West, and we only had minor technical difficulties, so things never change. Really pleased to introduce Professor Ozlem Ayduk, who will be presenting sort of a panoply of her research findings to us. Oz got her bachelor's degree in psychology and political science from Bosporus University. I'd say it in Turkish, but I would get it wrong. And then her doctorate in Columbia in psychology, and she worked with Walter Mischel and Geraldine Downing. Oz is a fellow of the APS and SPSP. She's published extensively in the top journals: Emotion, JPSB, Journal of Abnormal Psychology, Journal of Consulting in Clinical Psychology, Psych Science, Clinical Psychological Science, and has major handbook chapters in the big handbooks that are out in her field. Her work deals mainly with emotional reactivity and regulation. She's interested in individual differences in these kinds of processes, and in using basic psychological science to develop scalable interventions to help people with their emotion regulation. So without further ado, our first faculty research lecture of the year, Oz Ayduk.
Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Okay, very good. All right. So thank you for inviting me to this esteemed colloquium series. I really appreciate it, and I'm happy to be here to tell you about the work I have been doing in my close collaborator Ethan Cross and our students over the last now 15 years. Okay, so before I start, I should probably define what I mean by self-distancing. And the social psychologists in the room are probably very familiar with this idea of psychological distance, which refers to the act of mentally moving away from an immediate experience that's happening in the here and now, which tends to be always anchored in the present state of the self. So self-distancing is transcending one's egocentric, immersed view of the self. In more colloquial terms, think of it as thinking of selves that are different from the one that is experiencing this room, this presentation, etc. And over the years, we have focused on different kinds of cognitive strategies or techniques that enhance self-distancing, and then looked at their implications for emotion regulation, relationship functioning, behavior, etc. So one of the first ones that we started out with was what we refer to as visual distancing. In processing negative experiences, people usually have visual imagery of the event that took place. What if we manipulate the perspective from which you are mentally imagining yourself in this experience and trying to sort through your emotions? So we refer to that as the take the perspective of the fly on the wall and kind of see the experience unfold in your mind's eye. Another technique we have studied is with Oliver here as one of our colleagues, temporal distancing. So think about events that are bothering you now, but now role play, it's 10 years from now. How will the self 10 years from now will feel and think about the experience that's happening today? And the third one is linguistic self-distancing, which we refer to as third-person self-talk, where we are looking at the pronouns people use to refer to themselves when they are privately introspecting about their emotional experiences. And that's the topic I'm going to focus on today. So just to bring to life the phenomenon that I'm talking about, I want to share a short video. So this is Jane that you're going to watch. She's 3 years old and she's in the marshmallow task. This is Stephanie Carlson's data from University of Minnesota. And she has the I think, raisins, 2 little raisins on one side, 1 little raisin on the other side, and she's trying to kind of deal with this situation. So she made the decision to wait, and she's trying to sustain that decision until the experimenter comes back.
I want to eat those raisins. They're gonna eat them. So, what's your Jane's gonna do? If she takes one, Jane's not gonna have all these. She might choke. So, if you want, Sam could eat those raisins, Jane.
So at the end, Jane instructs Jane to eat the raisins. So the delay is prematurely ended. But if you look at how she performed in this task, this is normative data where we see that, as children age from 2.5 to 5.5, they are more and more able to delay gratification. And this is Jane's age group, 3-year-olds. And this is where Jane performed at the level of a 5-year-old. Obviously, this is anecdotal data. It's cute, but what can it conclude on the basis of N of 1? But we basically asked the question, does the switch from I to Jane, as illustrated in this example, serve any real self-regulatory function? So that's the question we're going to try to address. So our rationale was very simple. We know from prior work that psychological distance facilitates both self-control and emotion regulation, and part of this literature is our work on the other psychological distance techniques we have examined. And the connection to the pronouns comes from the expressive writing literature, where they have conceptualized and measure psychological distance with the frequency with which people use first-person pronouns. The extent to which I am focusing on I am immersed in my egocentric point of view, to the extent that I use first-person pronouns to a lesser degree, I am more distant. For example, depressed individuals use more I in their descriptions of experiences. And the other rationale point was pretty straightforward. I mean, there's such a strong association between second and third person pronouns and the fact that we refer to other people. I mean, we rarely use our own name or she for myself or they to refer to ourselves. So the idea was that these automatic associations with others who are naturally distanced from the self may kind of trick our minds, so to speak, to think of the self as if we are somebody else, and then reap the benefits of actually reasoning about somebody else's problems rather than my own problems. So with that rationale, we did a number of studies, initial studies, JPSP style, 6 studies in one single paper. So I'm going to briefly talk about those studies, and then I want to spend more time telling you about the ongoing projects and some of the remaining questions that I think are interesting. Okay, so in most of our studies that we ran in this study, we have a very standard paradigm. Initially, we induce stress by way of speech task or first impressions, meeting someone for the first time. And then we manipulate first person versus third person talk, and then we measure outcomes. So that's the general procedural flow. And I will present data from one of those studies. So in this task, we induce stress by telling participants you're going to do the Trier social stress task, an impromptu surprise speech task in front of 2 evaluators who are trained in evaluating speech performance. And this is a task that have been demonstrated to elicit the HPA axis. So it's a very good model of inducing stress, physiological stress in the laboratory. So we did all that, and then we gave people a very short period of time to prepare, and no materials, nothing to write on. And then just before they were introduced to the evaluators, we manipulated pronoun use. We, for the first person group, we said we're also interested in how kind of people prepare themselves psychologically for this kind of situation. You know, some people use first person pronouns to refer to themselves. Others may use non-first person pronouns, even though this may sound strange. You know, some people do it. And that's what we would like you to do today. And we asked them to use the first person versus non-first person pronouns to understand their emotions. Why are you kind of like anxious about this upcoming task? So that's something that I want to underscore. In our studies, we always ask people to process their emotions, not avoid their emotions. So engage with your emotions, and let's just try to explain them away. We're social psychologists interested in attribution. People are kind of like built to search for meaning and explanation, particularly to get over negative emotions. So we're trying to see what kind of tricks can we play with their minds to allow them to be able to explain without getting stuck in ruminative thought cycles. So in this particular study, we had them deliver the speech, and then we left them alone for 5 minutes to tap into whether or not they were kind of playing what happened over and over again in their heads to kind of assess rumination. So what we found is that, first of all, third person or non-first person speech group had more or less negative emotions after the speech task. So this is the first person group. You see that they go up in negative emotions from baseline to post-speech task, whereas the slope is negative for the non-first person group. If you look at shame as a specific emotion, because we know that in terms of discrete emotions, public speaking situations elicits shame, you see the same pattern. If you look at rumination during the rumination period, again, first person group is reporting a greater engagement, post-event processing about why did I do that, you know, why did this happen, like I should have said this, I should have said that. And then most importantly, we had basically blind coders code the videotapes of their performance to look at, you know, who performs better. And what we see is that participants in the non-first person condition delivered objectively, at least visibly, better speeches than people in the non-first person condition. So this performance finding also generalized to another study in this package of studies, which was about first impressions, same kind of procedure, but this time it was like you're going to meet with this person. The goal is to leave as good a first impression as possible on this person you're gonna meet. Could be a dating potential, who knows. And then they were videotaped, and then again coders coded for their social behavior as a performance index, and again non-first person group performed better in that task as well. Okay, so what is the mechanism? Like what is going on when people switch from first to third person language that's causing these shifts in emotion? The obvious place to look at are, of course, appraisals. And we know from Jim Blaskowicz's work, Lazarus and Folkman, stressors are naturally appraised along the threat and challenge dimension. And to the extent that we perceive the demands of the situation, the difficulty of the situation to exceed our own ability, our own resources, we're going to show this threat response. We're going to appraise the situation as threatening. And that's negative arousal. Tends to lead to maladaptive response profiles. but to the extent that we think our resources either meet or exceed the demands of the situation, we're going to be challenged. It's more like positive arousal, excitement, so to speak. So the prediction is that we know from tons and tons of other work on psychological distance that when people have low distance to an experience, they represent that experience in concrete experiential terms. So, oh my God, I haven't had a chance to prepare. Oh my God, I'm going to have to give a speech. And those are precisely the kinds of features of the situation that should make people feel there are lots of demands here. And maybe I don't have enough resources. Whereas when you're distant, you may focus less on those concrete features of the situation, and there may be more room for you to think of this as maybe something exciting that I can cope with. And to test this, we again used our speech paradigm. We told them the same thing, exactly the same thing, but before we had them give the speech, we had them think about, tell us about what you thought. First person, non-first person. And we never actually asked them to give the speech itself, so the study actually ended there because we were interested in the mechanism in and of itself. So I'll give you some examples of what people said. These are examples from the first person group. I can't prepare an oral speech in 3 minutes. It takes days for me to examine my strengths and weaknesses. Blah, blah, blah. This is not going to work out. I don't think I'm prepared. So you can see that the focus is all on the demands, the difficulty of the situation. And if anything, they're and I don't have the ability, the preparedness to deal with this. If you look at non-first person self-talk, I told myself that I'm not under a lot of pressure, I'm qualified, and I have worked hard, I have confidence in my abilities. This person is entirely focusing on their own resources, how they're prepared and able to meet the demands. Firstly, I asked myself, what was I nervous about? It's not like this will be the first interview or speech. I thought about reassuring and comforting thoughts. So I did not cherry pick these, if you can believe that. Actually, these differences were very visible, dramatically visible, actually. So we looked at challenge-threat ratios. We coded for demands and resources. In the essays, this is the coded data. We also asked participants themselves, how difficult did you think this situation was? Do you think that you have the ability to cope with it? And you see the same pattern of findings where higher scores on the y-axis means more challenge, less threat, that the first-person group is reporting greater levels of challenge appraisals. And I should mention that those essays were originally in the non-first-person group, was written in third-person language, but before coding, we translated them all into first person so that, coders were blind condition. Okay, yeah, and this is the 73% of participants who received the highest possible score on challenge was in the non-first person condition, and kind of like the opposite for threat. So they weren't actually cherry picked. Okay, so somebody else, given all our replication crisis in social psychology, we're proud to present that somebody else who has nothing to do with us replicated this finding, looking at actually cardiovascular indices of challenge threat, and so that's really reassuring. Okay, so just to recap these illustrative findings from initial studies, non-person or third-person self-talk, I'm going to refer to third-person just for the sake of simplicity, impacts cognition, emotion, behavior, generalizes across different kinds of stressors, interpersonal, performance situations. We also did a study when the Ebola epidemic was threatening the United States. We ran a naturalistic experiment during that time, and we demonstrated similar effects for the way people thought about their likelihood of having an epidemic in the United States, and we have run samples, undergraduates, MTurk samples, which tend to be a little bit more representative. So with those initial studies, we set out to look at different aspects of this process. One of the things that we addressed was moderators. Are there boundary conditions for the effectiveness of third-person self-talk? We looked at neural mechanisms with colleagues, collaborators who know what they're talking about. So I'll talk about the neuroscience aspect at a very kind of conceptual level. And then we tried to develop pilot interventions to see what the effects are in leading to long-term change. So for moderators, the one obvious moderator is the degree to which you're dealing with an experience that's moderately intense or extremely intense. There is now growing evidence from the broader, James Grossian reappraisal, cognitive appraisal literature that under highly stressful situations, people prefer to distract rather than reappraise, engage in cognitive change. And most importantly, Liz Phelps' lab has in recent years published a paper showing that cognitive emotion regulation fails the stress test. So the idea is that to the extent that reappraisal or cognitive change is effortful, demands cognitive resources, it's under precisely very stressful situations that deplete people of resources that you're going to want to use it, but it's going to be ineffective because you don't have the resources to engage in reappraisal. So we first addressed this question behaviorally, and we ran a within subjects this study where we had people recall and rate the intensity of a series of negative experiences. In one study, it was about future events that they were anxious about happening. In the other one, it was about past events that have happened but are still cause of distress. And then they came back a week later. We told them about the I strategy and the name strategy here. We just used, you think about why this, experience makes us feel this way versus why does it make me feel this way. And then they reflected on each experience either with the I or the name cue. They rated their negative emotions following reflection. Again, this was a within subjects design. So this is kind of the design of the study. And I'll just present results from study 1 because study 2 is very similar. What we found is that event intensity did not moderate. Basically, it was as effective for high intensity experiences as it was for low intensity experiences. So this suggests that it's kind of this strategy is somewhat different from reappraisal in the James Gross sense in terms of its cognitive demands. So there's like one clue here about that issue I'm going to address more directly in the neuroscience part. Okay, so what are the neural mechanisms? We turned to this level of analysis, not only because it's cool, and it's very cool, we admit, but because it allowed us to answer some questions that we may not be able to answer with behavioral data. One thing was, given that it passes the stress test or task, so one question was like, how quickly does this work and how effortful is this? And then we were also interested in whether it reduces self-referential processing at the neural level. That kind of is the analog of what we refer to as self-distancing. So it was important in terms of looking at that phenomenon at different levels of analysis. So in one study, it was an ERP study, which gives us great temporal resolution, so we can actually precisely kind of measure when in the processing of a negative situation, the effect of the name, strategy kicks in. And the ERP component we specifically looked at in this study was the late positive potential, LPP. This is normative data or data from some other study that shows that this component responds to both positive and negative stimuli, so it's just reactive to emotional stimuli and not neutral, so it doesn't differentiate between pleasant and unpleasant, but between emotionally evocative versus neutral. And it's considered to be kind of like attention to attentional emotional information. And in this study, we used the IAPS pictures. Again, it was a within subjects design. People looked at a series of negative IAPS pictures, either with the I versus the name strategy. And what we found is that basically within 1,000 milliseconds, the third person group was showing kind of like it neutralized the emotional information. It's looking more like the neutral stimulus compared to the first person group. And the other thing is we didn't find any differences in stimulus preceding negativity, SPN, which is another component of ERPs that has been linked with effortful control or cognitive reappraisal in emotion regulation studies. So the fact that we didn't find any differences suggested to us that, well, maybe that there is a differential engagement of cognitive control at least. So the second study was an fMRI study, greater spatial resolution, and here we know from prior work that MPFC is what we're looking for if we want to see if the name strategy reduces self-referential processing. And then this also allowed us to look at some very well identified networks in the brain, lateral PFC, superior parietal, in terms of their effect on cognitive control. So we again use the within subjects design. This time we use autobiographical negative experiences. People generated these experiences and gave us like little cue words to identify them in a subsequent session. And what we found was that as we anticipated, the use of the name strategy basically reduced activation in the MPFC compared to the I strategy. And activation in the MPFC tracked with people's self-reports of how negatively they felt. When you looked at the name versus I comparisons, however, there was really no activation, differential activation. So we didn't see greater activation in the lateral PFC with the name strategy, suggesting that, again, at least there isn't a differential recruitment of effortful control networks in the use of the third-person self-talk. I'm going to skip this because basically we replicated this finding in a study where we had white mentors give critical feedback to African American mentees, and we found that people who prepared for this provision of feedback with the name strategy were less anxious. They provided better, more helpful feedback to their mentees as coded by, again, independent judges. So the next question is, and this is kind of like where my passion lies, though it is very difficult, so I don't know how far I will go. So the question we asked was, can it be taught in brief training studies? And the second question was, does it have beneficial implications for people who are particularly vulnerable, people who are high in rumination, people who are high in neuroticism? So to answer those questions, we ran 2 studies. In one, it was an in-lab training study, all computerized. We had people, undergraduates, come to the lab. It's hard to say we taught them how to use third-person self-talk. There's nothing to teach. We just tell them to do it. but we have them complete implementation intentions protocols where they say they commit to using this strategy whenever they face negative situations in their lives. The active control condition was, relax, calm down. Again, we did not teach them relaxation techniques. We said, remember to relax whenever you face these kinds of negative experiences in your everyday life, or the passive control, no instructions. We had a 10-day diary study following the training, and the two things that we're interested in here was rumination, the degree to which they engage in ruminative kind of like cyclic thought processing, and then the negative affect composite, and they were very highly correlated and yielded similar results. So basically, what we found was not a main effect, but an interaction with trait vulnerability. So people for whom these kinds of emotional situations were hard to deal with to start with, people high in brooding, rumination, trait neuroticism, for them, self-distancing basically eliminated their vulnerability to rumination. For the relaxation and the no-instruction group, so those are the light bars, you see the typical effect of trait vulnerability. If you're high in neuroticism, you're ruminating more. Or if you're high in neuroticism, you have a more negative affect. But if you are in the distancing condition, that basically vulnerability was eliminated. We found a similar pattern for a follow-up where 6 months later and 3 months later we measured depression. We found a similar pattern, but the difference there, one difference was relaxation was also kind of benefiting people. Even though we didn't find any differences on these mediators, so we know it's not working through these mechanisms, maybe it's through working something else, providing trait neurotic people with any kind of reminder about relaxation eventually ended up helping them. So there's an interesting kind of story there. And the other study was online. We did with AmTurk participants. Again, we had the third-person self-talk. Here, our active control was positive reframing, find the silver lining. We went for this because this is kind of the gold standard in, optimism, positive framing. We know it works. So we wanted to gauge kind of like how effective is third-person self-talk compared to positive framing and the passive control, no instructions. This was a shorter longitudinal study, and we looked at functioning both in terms of positive indicators and negative indicators before and after the training. And here we did not find an interaction with trait vulnerability. What we found was that in the control group, over time, well-being decreased, ill-being increased. If you looked at positive reframing, this pattern was reversed. And then if you looked at third-person or self-distancing training, again, the pattern was reversed. And even though positive reframing was slightly more effective than third-person self-talk, that was not a statistically significant difference. So it was at least as effective as positive reframing. So just to take stock, so given everything, I think, I hope that I convinced you that third-person self-talk enhances emotion regulation and adaptive behavior across a number of stressful experiences. It does so by changing the way people think about those situations, and maybe without necessarily relying on extra cognitive resources. Might benefit vulnerable individuals to a greater extent and can be trained in these brief interventions with consequences for well-being in real life. So what are some questions, remaining questions that I think or we think are interesting? One kind of like obvious one is, okay, clinical populations, does this help people with clinical disorders? I don't really have an answer for that, and hopefully some clinical science colleagues will, be interested in answering that question. The second question is individual differences. Like some people do this spontaneously, and do they do it more or less compared to other people? When we first started doing this work, there was a big difference between my baseline and my, collaborator Ethan's baseline. I was like, I never talk to myself in the third person, and he was like, oh, I talk to myself in the third person all the time. So now I do, knowing what I know, but my baseline was like, never. So, and we were convinced there are individual differences because all these celebrities and famous people, it was popping up in the media about like how they talk to themselves. So the first one was Lebron James, when he gave the ESPN interview and said, I didn't want to make an emotional decision. I wanted to do what is best for Lebron James and whatever would make Lebron James happy. And of course, everybody, whenever I give this example, they're like, oh, but that's like a narcissism. Maybe he's a narcissist. And I think people who talk to other people and refer to themselves in the third person are probably narcissists, but he was reporting on his inner monologue, right? And lucky for us, but I mean, we're capitalizing on some very sad life stories here. In contrast to Lebron James, Malala Yousafzai, who was the target of Taliban, also basically became famous for what she said in this Daily Show interview about her reactions to when she learned she was going to be the target of Taliban. And she says, I said to myself, Malala, you must be brave. You must not be afraid of anyone. You're only trying to get an education. You're not committing a crime. Again, another example. And I think we can agree that we kind of like rule out the narcissism explanation from LeBron James to Malala. And then recently I came across Sylvester Stallone's, kind of reflections on the movie Creed, where he says, I said to myself, I want you to realize you're the weakest person in this movie. You're not a threat to anyone. You're a ghost. You're just waiting for your turn to meet your friends again on the other side. So people clearly do this spontaneously, but are these just unique experiences, or some people do it, regularly? So we don't have a lot of data. We're just starting to scratch the surface of this question, but we did do an ESM study for 2 weeks, and we asked people to report to the degree to which they engaged in self-talk, like talk to themselves in these 4 kinds of situations. And if they did talk to themselves, whether it was in the first person voice or in the third person voice, basically what you see is that in situations which require kind of like feedback, corrective behavior, emotional regulation, being critical of the self to make oneself feel better, the third person self-talk becomes more frequent. So, everybody's doing more first-person self-talk than third-person self-talk. I don't think that's surprising. But what is interesting is that when people do engage in third-person self-talk, that is happening in self-control and emotion regulation situations. And whether you talk to yourself in the first person or third person was not related to narcissism or on self-report measures. So happy to report that. So there's clearly a lot more to be done here, but here's some interesting findings. So the next question is, if there are individual differences, what's happening in development? How do these individual differences develop? When do they develop? At what age does this kind of shift to third-person language might help children regulate their emotions? So there are things that we already know, and there are things we don't yet know. And the things we already know mostly come from Stephanie Carlson's lab. This isn't the work that we have done. but she has tested this kind of third-person self-talk in experimental studies with 3 to 5 years old, and has shown that it enhances executive functioning among 5-year-olds, but not among 3-year-olds, and then also enhances goal pursuit and persistence among 4 to 6-year-olds. So we know that it's kind of like working as early as 4 years of age. But what we don't know is, like, do they implement the strategy spontaneously, and where is that spontaneous usage really coming from? Where do they learn it from? That I don't have answers to, but I think is a direction we're actively pursuing. The last interesting future direction is we're looking at language more broadly as a lever for self-regulation. So one thing that Susan Gelman and her students with Ethan has done at Michigan is to look at the function of generic you. So not just second-person pronouns to refer to myself, but generic you that we use to express general norms, such as like you cook turkey on Thanksgiving. That's a general norm. Basically, things we routinely do. Most people do to refer to some kind of social custom or norm. But if it is used in the way we kind of like try to make sense of negative experiences, the idea is that, well, it may normalize the experience by creating greater distance, self-distancing, because it says it's not just about you, it's about the humanity, people more broadly. And there are some really interesting, again, examples of famous people talking using generic you. Sheryl Sandberg, after she lost her husband, tragically says, tragedy presents a choice. You can give in to the void, the emptiness that fills your heart, or you can try to find meaning. This is very kind of, I like this example. And then there's Donald Trump. I thought, I wouldn't leave you without mentioning our new president. I fight like hell to pay as little in taxes as possible. I'm a businessman, and that's the way you're supposed to do it. So clearly this isn't good or bad in its own right, but it can be, used in the service of good or in the service of bad. But they have shown in a series of studies that indeed generic you serves an emotion regulatory function. And in my lab, we have started looking at foreign language processing and how that may create psychological distance and aid emotion regulation. And there's already some evidence from the kind of the social psychology JDM folks showing that processing information in a foreign language reduces decision-making biases such as loss aversion. And this is work done by Kazar at University of Chicago. And the mechanism that they propose is, well, foreign language processing, foreign language, it's not as automatic. It requires more effortful, systematic thought. So once you put people in this more systematic, analytic processing mode, that's why it reduces these JDM biases. I mean, I don't have any problems with that explanation, but our idea is, contribution is that in addition, it may also be less associated with the self-concept. It's learned later. Therefore, it's not as part of who you are as the first language is, and in that sense may serve an emotion regulation function. So to test this hypothesis, we ran a large study with English-Spanish bilinguals in the US and in Latin America, where we randomly assigned people to write about negative experiences either in their native language or in the foreign language. And what we find is that when people write about these experiences in their non-native language, they report feeling greater psychological distance to that event. This event is further away from me which then is related to lower levels of emotional reactivity to that event. So this is going to be another kind of direction that we're probably going to pursue. And with that, oh yeah, and I think this is really important because it has implications for therapy with everything we are facing, immigration, minority mental health. I mean, you would think doing the therapy in one's native language is the desirable mode of, doing therapy. But this may kind of like make us pause for a second and really consider how language may become part of the therapeutic process itself. This is probably not necessary anymore, I hope. But why should we care? We all have an internal monologue. This is very common. We all talk to ourselves. And what we're showing here is that really the small tweaks we engage in the way we refer to ourselves, talk to ourselves, can impact a wide range of phenomena. And understanding more the boundary conditions, why it's happening, how it's happening, is an important thing to pursue. With that, I thank my, Ethan Cross, my long-term collaborator, our other collaborators, and postdocs and students. Not all of them are listed here. There isn't enough space, but at least the key ones are there. And thank you for listening.
Fantastic beginning to the year series. The Faculty Lectures Committee puts on these events, a distinguished faculty lecture when one of our emeritus faculty comes forward. Rona Weinstein will be here in March. We've got two other, Iris Malice and David Whitney, also presenting faculty research lectures in March. We have a reception, but as I was just telling myself, Steve, the food wouldn't really taste that good unless we had a good discussion first. So Steve, I think we should engage in discussion with the speaker. So let's do that and then we'll have a reception.
Thank you so much for sharing your research. It was really interesting to hear about that. I was curious, in thinking about kind of the language shift leading to an attribution shift, I was thinking that sometimes the attributions we make about others are maybe not quite so charitable as the ones for ourselves, kind of like a fundamental attribution error sort of way. I'm just curious what your thinking is about why would it be that if we tend to think of ourselves a little bit less kind of egocentrically, why that might not lead to the biases we sometimes extend to people who aren't us?
Can you elaborate a little bit more? Is Jess here? Is this your dissertation question? I think that's our dissertation question. So are you saying does self-distancing reduce fundamental attribution bias, or?
Well, it's more that what I took away from this, maybe I'm wrong, is that when we change the language, we talk to ourselves and we kind of get a little bit of self-distancing from ourselves. So if we're thinking of ourselves more like we think of other people, might that bring along with it the biases that we sometimes apply to other people, like in the fundamental?
Or, yeah, there is actually data that shows that it reduces self-serving biases. Exactly, the egocentric biases that we have, it reduces, for example, in moral dilemmas that we may face with close others versus strangers. When we face a moral transgression basically engaged by a stranger, the right course of action is very clear. When it's your significant other, your child, your relative, then the moral calculus gets very complicated. And self-distancing, there is a paper under review from Ethan's lab that shows that it actually changes the calculus a little bit, and you're more likely to report even a significant other for that moral transgression. I don't know if I answered that question, but maybe we can talk more during reception.
Thank you.
Please.
So yeah, really cool work. I'm really drawn to the intervention part. So as I'm thinking about, I'm just wondering, can you say anything more about the delivery? Is it like in that moment, there's a training and that training entails them doing an exercise in which they're writing in third person, or is it also, or more so, you're instructing them to do this regularly? Because you have effects that are over time. I was just wondering, like, is it scaffolding or is it like...
Both. So we tell them what the strategy is. There's no teaching. There's really nothing to teach. And then they implement it with respect to past events that they are bothered by, or future events they're concerned about in the lab. And then once we know, do you feel comfortable with this? Does this now make sense, how you do implement the strategy? Say yes, yes, yes. Okay, now let's think about, for the next 2 weeks, the kinds of situations you may face that may be challenging for you. I mean, this is the classic Peter Goldwitzer implementation intentions kind of paradigm. So they come up with those situations, and then they make implementation intentions. When somebody kind of like cuts me in the line, right? Then I'm going to talk to myself in the third person. I am going to try to relax the best way I can. So we have them form those intentions and plans, and then tell them to use the strategy for the next 2 weeks. But it's not a very strong manipulation, so it's a miracle that we have something. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's really exciting stuff. I'm wondering how it could be applied. It seems like it would apply very well to health behaviors, just as happened with the baby. Being able to control overeating, being able to remember not to do something.
Yes, it has all those applications, but I don't see it. I mean, yes, that's what we would expect, but there's also a ton of work already from construal level theory that has looked at those kinds of behaviors, not necessarily by our technique from our conceptual framework, but by using other strategies that increase distance. Yes.
And one other question, and that is, if you're talking, say you're talking to a child, and you're trying to help the child do something, rather than say, you know, Jane, you should do this, she should do this. In other words, might you be able to encourage third person thinking by using third person talking to someone?
Well, I mean, we're running some studies to address that kind of question. We bring kids and moms to the lab, and then they engage in play, and then, you know, everything is everywhere, and then it's time to clean up, and this is a major trigger for children. The moment you ask them to clean up, there's like wailing. Like they feel it's completely unfair for them to clean up on their own. So in that context, we're actually manipulating the mom, saying, you know, so I don't know the results yet, but we're kind of, I mean,
that's
great. Mm-hmm.
So do you think if people use the self-distancing technique for a while, it might generalize to positive events as well? So they are less excited about good things that are happening?
Yes, I mean, technically, I mean, in theory, that's what we would predict. We haven't done it with the third person language technique, but we have looked at that question specifically with other techniques of distancing. That's what we would predict, and that's what we find. For example, with temporal distancing, if you say 10 years from now, I'm not even going to remember that I got an A+ on this exam, you go. So, I mean, depending on the kind of the cultural values like one has, like in this culture, you probably don't want to use third person tap talk or any kind of distancing for positive emotions. You want to maximize positive, minimize negative. But if you're in China, in Asia, what is important is to be kind of stable, moderate, you're not overreacting to either one, then maybe the prescription should be, I use this as much as possible. So it's not, I think, good or bad in and of itself. It really depends on what goal it serves and what context it's being used in.
I'm wondering, I love this line of research, and I was wondering if you might extend the differential language aspect. One of the things that I was wondering about, that could be the different languages are more or less likely to use
first name like Jane or something like that. Or I've heard, and you would know this way better than I, that in Turkish people are less likely to use genderized pronouns like he or she. And if that were the case, then that might reduce one aspect of the non-person. And I'm wondering if you could even correlate that with like depression rates in different countries or things like that. It might be interesting just to sample different countries that have differential use of first-person usage, even in their internal, voice.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Great idea. We have no data. I mean, Turkish doesn't have he, she. That's why I use he, she randomly. So you should always ignore my pronouns and don't take it as an offense. My brain still cannot track it, in the heat of the moment. I can write properly, but I can't speak grammatically.
Yeah, it's incredible work. I want to see how you handle an alternative explanation of your results. So, you put a lot of investment in this idea of temporal distance and sort of this conceptual act of moving away from the immersed self, but third-person perspective may have a kind of an emotional, relational pattern of associations, right? We hear our name being spoken by other people, and friends and family members, and those have a lot of emotional associations, right? I feel supported and attached to those people. That can produce that same pattern of results that you're getting, right? Less stress, perform better, different cardiovascular profile. It's not distance per se, which is hard to measure.
Well, I don't have a problem with that explanation. I don't think it's just that, but it could be that, and we actually tested that in one study, because this is a question we always get, and so we did manipulate first person, third person self-talk, and then the idea was that if these are just, it's not about distance, but we have these internalized dialogues. Whenever I'm asked to refer to myself as Oz, I remember intentionally, consciously or not, like my mom giving me advice. It's my mom, I'm parroting her back. So if that's the case, then once I engage in that language, those concepts should be more accessible. Granted that it wasn't a great study design, we did not, and we pre-registered, so because it was a null hypothesis, we said we don't expect any differences. We didn't find any differences, but I'm not super confident. I think it's still an interesting explanation, and I would have no problem if that was another factor, but from the little data I have, I don't think it's just that.
Okay.
Yeah, so to follow up on that, I was also wondering about why these effects, why you get these effects. And I think the construal level story is totally plausible. I guess I'm wondering, do you have sort of manipulation checks at construal level, right, where people might score differently on the BIF, right, like this classic measure.
Never found any findings with that measure,
Yeah,
and
it's a fair
I'm
measure.
Me neither.
very skeptical of papers that report effects.
So, but the other prediction I think you would make is that, and I think you start to address this here, is that actually any manipulation of construal level should have these effects, right? Not just this self-talk, but other much less implicit and much less sort of emotionally loaded manipulation should have similar effects, if I understand correctly.
I wouldn't call them distinguish this versus other, even more emotionally, I forget what phrase you used, relevant or loaded strategies, but the underlying principle of psychological distance, holds. Yes, I mean, other types of construal manipulations that increased distance should have a dampening effect on affect, no question. But you had another point there.
I guess
Manipulation check. Yes, we've coded people's essays, on abstract versus concrete dimension, and we find that our initial studies on visual distancing always coded for what people thought in terms of abstract construals versus concrete construals, and that has always been the mediator. of the behavioral and emotion effects.
I had two things. First was just to follow on from Zach's point. I guess like often people have nicknames, so they may be called different things by different people. And I wonder if like the idea is it's actually tapping into something about your relationship with people who call you that, if you'd expect to get different effects depending on which name was used. And then the other thing, which maybe particularly is pertinent, you can comment on from your own experience as well, not, she says, Rudy's looking at me, is whether you would expect couples who are of different native languages to have better interpersonal emotion regulation abilities and relationship management skills, because neither of you are resolving it in your native language, and whether you would do a study of, I guess there being so many other
compounding variables. That's interesting. Well, I mean,
how about your N of 1?
I can't speak to my relationship with Rudy because I never talked to him in Turkish, but I've observed that with my children. So I'm actually a lot more kind of rational or powerful if I'm scolding them in English, as opposed to in Turkish, in which case I feel like I'm an emotional wreck and like, you know, it's just like too much and it's not as powerful. In English I feel like it's cold, it's boom, 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 I'm saying it as I see it. So I can relate to that. But it would be, yeah. What was the other question? I missed.
Oh no, the other one was just one of that pet names and how you get different.
Yes. I mean, if it is indeed, you know, significant other representations that are partly accounting for these effects, yes, we would expect. Yeah, it's very difficult to study that process in the lab. And Steve.
So you had said that there are other distancing strategies that can reduce negative affect, and you threw reappraisal up there as an example. But I think what you also showed was that reappraisal, it requires much more cognitive effort for that strategy to be successful, at least in intense negative experiences, whereas the third person talk may not require quite as many cognitive resources. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of what that is about. Like if I have like a blood phobia, for example, and I know I'm going to give blood, I can say I'm going to pass out, is bad. But if I said Anne's going to pass out, maybe not as bad. But then I try to reappraise that whole situation. Oh, Anne's going to be looking at a science experiment or something. That's going to require more cognitive effort because I'm creating this whole different scenario in reappraisal versus just flipping a word. What's your sense of what the difference, cognitively speaking, between reappraisal and then the third person talk?
Okay, so I think I want to differentiate or make a distinction between reappraisal as a process, cognitive change, changing the meaning of an emotion eliciting situation, versus the strategy of reappraisal that appears in most of emotion regulation studies inspired by James Gross's work. I think those two terms are being used interchangeably, but they're not the same thing, right? So we think of all of the things, the techniques we're studying, as some kind of reappraisal, changing the meaning strategy. But some are more effortful than others. For example, our visual distancing is very similar to what James Gross does to manipulate reappraisal, and is effortful. It's the third person one, because as I mentioned, I think the second and third person pronouns so automatically associated with thinking about other people, implementing that is effortless. At least in the lab studies where they're passively looking at pictures. I mean, I don't buy for a second that it's completely effortless when you're in the heat of an intense argument with your, you know, romantic partner. But at least in standard paradigms where cognitive reappraisal has been shown to be effortless, we don't see that effect. I wouldn't say it's, effortless in its everyday usage, but the switch is very easy. There's nothing to learn, and I think that makes it powerful. Does that? Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to overlook the clinical implications on your last slide. And throughout your talk, I was thinking about the CDC data from this summer, right in between the deaths by suicide of Kate Spade and Anthony Bourdain, 20-year high suicide rates in our country in all age groups. The #1 cause of death for girls 15 to 19 around the world is suicide. And you think of suicide notes, there couldn't be more of a first-person preoccupation with burdening others, and life can't go on and can't live that emotional pain. Clearly you're starting with normative populations and you want to start early in the chain, but at what point, I'm wondering kind of out loud, I don't know if it's a question or a reflection, could with clinically depressed people, and if you're depressed enough, suicide becomes part of the picture, would this work be important to bring into therapy? Would it be too little too late by a person's at that stage? I'm just not sure.
I'm going to give a very defensive response to this, which is that I don't think I'll ever get funded to work with clinical populations. So it's a very, the boundaries are very, I don't know, it's very strict. So I've tried. So that's why I said I'm going to leave the clinical implications question to my clinical colleagues, because you can't get through NIH, even when we have a well-known clinical scientist like you or Sherry Johnson on our grant, that we are just completely shut down. So that's why I am.
Well, would you predict what he says is true? I mean, forget whether you can get a grant to do it. Would you address what he is saying as maybe a very important?
I mean, I think, I don't really know depression. I'm not an expert, and I don't know what leads up to that moment of actually committing suicide. As Steve mentioned, it may be too late at that point. Whether I refer to myself in the third person or first person may make no difference at all. So I don't know the literature well enough to make that kind of prediction. But if you use it early on, I mean, based on the findings we have, we would expect to see some benefits. But this is one little strategy. I mean, this has to be part of a suite of therapeutic techniques. But it can definitely be, I think, incorporated. It doesn't hurt, because there's always this question of whether it's not that it won't work, but that it will hurt clinical samples. When we first started our work on visual distancing, that was one of the barriers we had to overcome with clinical folks, because they were like, this seems too kind of like intellectualization, so it's actually going to hurt people who are clinically depressed. We did run a study with clinically depressed participants to show that it doesn't hurt them. It helps them even more than normal populations. So I don't think it's going to hurt them, so it can't, So, and it's so simple, why not? But I don't know how critical it is at the moment of suicide, committing a suicide. I think I saw some.
That was for some reason making me wonder also about if you can somehow do the flip and use different language for the other person. So in terms of like being better perspective taking of the other person's situation, and like maybe when the person's reaching out, rather than feeling abandoned, they can be thinking about how the people might be like self-involved or whatever else, or in an argument. So what about using I language for the other person in the dynamic?
Oh yeah, I think that's cool. We haven't done it, but yeah, I mean, like taking that person's perspective, and maybe the language is going to make that a much more powerful kind of mental switch. Will bring in more experiential components that may make it more real. Great idea. I've not done anything. I hadn't even thought about it. So I think
You've shared really useful insights about the consequences of self-distancing, and your talk got me thinking about causes of self-distancing. And the first situation that came to mind for me was unethical behavior. and the degree to which observing ourselves behave in unethical ways might prompt the motivation to distance the self and the feelings of guilt that might be associated with it. I wonder if you've thought about dysfunctional consequences of self-distancing.
Like Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it can be used for good or bad. It really depends on the goal that it serves. In our studies, we always manipulate the goal as well. I mean, we don't manipulate it, but we give people a goal to explain their emotions, because we, I mean, this is kind of our passion, have always been interested in how do we make people kind of reason through their emotions without rumination. And that requires the explicitly telling them, use this technique to try to understand your emotions. So in that epistemic context, it's functional. But if I wanted to use it to kind of like not feel anything, to really avoid, it may be dysfunctional. So, and I think the Trump example is a great example of it. Like, I can use it, you know. I mean, it's all to make myself feel better, but also to justify that behavior. Rich?
Have you done any studies where people have gone through a third-person manipulation multiple times to see how the effect size changes as a function of repetition or experience with it?
We've done the study where we had the intensity of emotions, like that was a within subjects design, and I don't think there was any interaction with time, but it's just like there wasn't kind of habituation or anything like that. Neither did it get bigger over time, though, as if I'm recalling it correctly. It's doable in a within subjects design, which is very important for us social psychologists.
So I'm seeing that it's 4:25 and my self-talk now says, I'm hungry, let's all go out there and celebrate with us.